Why are you arriving in an Uber? What happened to the SUV we bought you? Grandpa's voice detonated through the driveway, small and relentless as a splinter. He leaned against the gate like someone trying to recall how to stand. Rain had left the world lacquered and bright. The pavement held reflections of the streetlights like small accusations. I felt the rental receipt in my pocket like a hot coin and wanted, for one impossible moment, to tell him everything. The dent on the key, the lipstick stain I couldn't explain away, the way she'd started calling someone else by the pet name she once used for me. Instead I said, I missed the bus. It landed like a paper boat in a storm. Grandpa regarded me with patient confusion. He had lived long enough to know when to ask the question that mattered and when to let a lie slide. There was a softness in his eyes that made the lie taste worse. Inside, the house hummed with ordinary life. The kettle's sigh, the fridge's low complaint. Yet the photograph on the fridge, us 3 winters ago, sweating at a summer fair, looked like a relic of someone else's choices. She was in the yard kneeling among marigolds, hands dark with earth, hair already gathered into that careless knot she wore when she wanted to be alone. Up close, the lines at the corner of her eyes mapped out years of laughter that had nothing to do with the theft I felt. You're early, she said, and I felt the sentence calibrate itself, the way we calibrate thermostats trying to find where warmth once was. She smiled before she could help it, but the smile was taut like wire. We ate like people who have practiced silence. Food served, conversation measured, trivialities exchanged with the conscientiousness of people avoiding the central chasm. Grandpa told a story about a radio that lost its reception and laughed at his own dumb luck. His laugh filled the room the way a hand shelters a lit candle. I watched his hand rest on my father's. There are havens in ordinary gestures. Then there are exposures. That night, everywhere I looked, ordinary things seemed to hold a secret language. Misplaced magnets on the refrigerator, a coffee mug left upside down, a pair of sunglasses placed on the windowsill like they had been waiting. Weeks of small misalignments followed. She started taking calls in other rooms, angling her phone away when I came close. I found coffee receipts in my jacket from a shop 2 blocks away at 9 in the morning. A bouquet charged to her card on a Tuesday. Mundane transactions with extraordinary implications. Once I walked past the bedroom and saw the pillowcase slightly rumpled. A wrongness I pressed down like a finger on a bruise. Denial is a construction. It is not merely absence but design. I built explanations like bridges out of thin air. Maybe it's nothing, I told myself. Maybe it's a friend at work. Maybe she is lonely and innocently receiving affection that never becomes anything. People say that when they prefer the comfort of a possibility to the terror of the truth. Then came the black lace in the laundry basket. Foreign, intimate, perfumed with a citrus I did not own. I remember holding it and feeling as if my hands were holding a confession. Her voice when she explained had that small, exhausted quality that made the explanation itself sound like a request for mercy. It's not mine, she said, and the sentence sat between us like a promise she couldn't keep. Later, nights became exercises in policing memory. I retraced every step I could recall. The number of hours at the office, the nights I'd sat watching baseball to avoid the quiet, the dinners canceled because I had to work late. The mind becomes a cunning sculptor of rationale when threatened. It carves out reasons with patience and fervor. But some evidence resists elegant shaping. A photograph, a message, the smell of someone else, that's stubborn material. I hired a private investigator because curiosity becomes a debt that accrues terrible interest. The man I hired was small and smelled of smoke. He didn't need to look at me with pity. His job had taught him how to deliver wounds without theatrics. He gave me a folder of images that were all punctual in their cruelty. A parking lot where my SUV sat for an hour with another car nearby. A man by the entrance whose profile could have been sculpted out of the same clay as mine but with different choices. The pictures were ordinary. 2 people leaving a cafe, a hand resting on a small of a back. But that ordinariness made them sharper than any melodramatic tableau I could have imagined. I surface breathed through days. At work I became efficient in a way that felt like armor. At home I practiced not knowing. The mind plays weather with memory. Sunny one day, overcast the next. I told myself that confrontation could be handled like an appointment. Scheduled, prepared, tidy. I was wrong. Confrontations are a messy geography of instinct and history. We met at the park bench where we'd once stolen the first kiss. Behind the library that smelled of dust and history, the river moved like a patient witness, indifferent to how lives rearrange on its banks. I know, I said, because any other opener felt like a begging. She folded inward like paper. Her face in that light seemed transparent, each line a ledger of small and large choices. Do you? She asked. The question was both simple and monstrous. I hired someone, I said. I said it because I wanted facts, not poetry. I wanted to be able to hold proof instead of impressions. She didn't deny the photographs, not with words. Her body's language was a confession. A quick inhale, fingers knitting themselves, an exhale that was a small surrender. It's not what you think, she started, because people always start there. Her voice didn't command pity. It nudged toward negotiation. In the space where I expected explosive remorse, she offered nuance, loneliness, a step too many taken toward someone who listened, a mistake that began with a bruised heart and turned into a secret life. She said the other man's name like an incantation to make the story real. It started because you were somewhere else, she murmured at one point, and the accusation landed like freight. I wanted the catharsis of a scene. Slamming doors, shouts, decisive moral clarity. Instead, she painted a portrait of complicity made of omissions. She explained in fragments. Long lunches that began as comfort and grew into dependence. An emotional ledger where deposits went to the wrong account. He loved me in ways you stopped trying to, she said with a line I could not preempt or correct. Hurt is modular. Sometimes it arrives as a lightning strike. Sometimes it comes like the erosion of a shoreline you thought eternal. That evening the house felt different. Our photographs stared back as though they'd become exhibits in a museum of misremembered pasts. I opened the closet and at the back found a spare phone, small and unadorned, a true secret. A preview message lit its screen. Missed you earlier. Left the book. See you tonight? Jay. My name wasn't there. I pressed into it and found the loose coins of a clandestine life. Notes, arrangements, jokes, plans. She left with a compostable bag of belongings in the gray face of early morning, kissing my forehead like a benediction that tasted of ash. Grandpa stood by the gate and watched, his face unreadable but soft. He didn't ask about the SUV. He didn't ask anything. He only held the gate like a question that would wait. I left in an Uber. The Uber smelled of citrus and upholstery cleaner. That anonymous scent of commuters. The driver was a man who hummed under his breath at red lights. I watched the city slide by and felt my life collapse in a way that was both immediate and cumulative. Betrayal is not a single instant but an accrual of small events that, when summed, become a new landscape. I thought of every unremarkable night I'd chosen screens over speech, transactions over tenderness. Guilt is an expert at timing. Always present, even when you aren't ready to admit the craft. For a while I tried to fold anger into something recognizable. Fury at her, fury at the other man, fury at myself for having been so blind. But anger is easy. It has edges that a man can sharpen against his pride. The harder thing was to feel the complex ache. Love interspersed with contempt. Forgiveness edged with indelible hurt. In the quiet hours I replayed small kindnesses and wondered which were genuine and which had been routine. The mind, hungry for narrative, can always rewrite the past to fit a present need. We divided life like moving furniture through a door too small. There was paperwork and practicalities, who keeps the account with a higher balance, who gets the stack of postcards from the trips we never took. Every item had been heavy with memory. A chipped mug, the concert ticket from the summer we agreed to never move, a shirt that still smelled faintly of perfume. Removing objects felt like reading a book you had loved and discovering a footnote that made you see the whole differently. Weeks became a calendar of small renegotiations. We would attempt civil conversations and dissolve into stale arguments about who had contributed more to the household, what obligations meant, whose needs were legitimate. There were moments of tenderness, shared glances across a supermarket aisle, a hand brushed in the checkout line, that felt like misfires, signals from a love trying to find a route through treacherous ground. We both said things we later blamed on fatigue, as if exhaustion affords us the license to reveal our truest cruelties. Sometimes, in the middle of a mundane day, grief would unspool itself like a wound reopening. There were mornings when the flavor of coffee was too sharp, afternoons when a song on the radio landed like an accusation. Friends took sides, some slowly, some with the haste of people eager to have opinions. Grandpa mostly kept to himself, offering small practicalities, meals left on the porch, quiet calls every other evening asking if I'd eaten. That spoke of love without invasive questions. One afternoon as autumn leaned heavy and the trees were bleeding color, I found something in the SUV that pinched the breath from me again. A child's sticker flaked on the dashboard, pastel and slightly sticky. I took it with a trembling hand and turned it over like a relic. It imploded assumptions I hadn't yet made. The betrayal had begun to have consequences beyond our union. Days later, picking through messages on the secret phone became an unavoidable cruelty. There were photographs he had taken, selfies with her, candid shots of a cup of coffee in her kitchen, a book left on a counter with a note in handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone who had discovered new youth. There were plans. A weekend getaway, a promise to cat-sit. Nothing grand. Yet the ordinariness of it sat with the weight of the obscene. Ordinary betrayals compound to become extraordinary wounds. I told myself I should be indignant, that I should walk with my head high. But grief often disguises itself as practical concerns. There were creditors to call, whose words clipped like a metronome of reality. There was the matter of the house, shared, contested, full of the residue of two lives. One night, insomnia crowned me and I scrolled again. A new notification blinked like a tiny heart attack. An image. It was the SUV, parked at dusk, the streetlight haloing its roof. In the back seat, the blur resolved into a child asleep, cheek against the window, hair in a careless tangle. The child's hand clutched something folded and bright. The phone's caption read, "He fell asleep in the back. Didn't want to wake him. J." That one punctuation, the dash, then J, landed like a verdict. My hands trembled as if I had placed them in cold water. The photograph's intimacy was intolerable. Someone had captured and then chosen to show a private tenderness that did not belong to me. The child's eyelashes lay against cheeks like feathers. On the child's lap was a small drawing, thick, clumsy lines, a house, a sun with too many rays. In the corner, in a child's uneven scrawl, was a name I recognized, my name. I had never taught a child to write my name. Everything multiplied. Betrayal branched like roots. It ceased to be only about promises violated between two adult people and acquitted itself into the future, into another human being who, through no choice of their own, now carried pieces of our scandal inside them. The moral geometry shifted. What had seemed like an act between consenting, if flawed, adults now had collateral. I thought of Grandpa again. His question about the SUV, the way he had stood with his palms on the gate as if it might hold him in place. That question, small and strangely mundane before, swelled into something else. A probe into the logistics of a life that, unbeknownst to me, had been shared with more people than I believed. The SUV was not merely a vehicle. It had been a vessel of secret routines. When I confronted her about the child, when I was finally able to make that raw, clumsy demand for truth, her face did not flash with denial. Instead, it looked remarkably weary, as if she had been carrying a weather report in her pocket, and had finally reached me at a time when storms were unavoidable. "It's his," she said quietly. "He didn't ask for this either." She used the quiet voice people adopt when they want to grieve aloud without uproar. She had the posture of someone who had known for weeks and had chosen silence either out of fear or some warped idea of protection. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. I thought, what does one do in the presence of such complexity? The heart wants to be savage. Part of you wants to shout and make a clean line between right and wrong. But reality prefers convolutions. Here was a child who had a claim on both of us. Here was an adult who had loved in ways that had become theft and care at the same time. You cannot undo a life by decrees. Weeks progressed into a new kind of negotiation. Custody hearings are messy in the way lawsuits are. They require every party to become a ledger. But this was not merely legal. It was an ethical wilderness. People around us offered pronouncements with the thunderous certainty only strangers can muster. It was the family, Grandpa included, who gave the most complicated response, presents. Grandpa began leaving food on the porch more regularly. He would call and read the child's favorite stories slowly, as if memory might be a balm. In the quiet hours when anger sat down with us like an unwelcome dinner guest, I found myself revisiting the intimacy of those photographs, the messages, all of which had been weapons and lullabies. Sometimes I thought of the other man, Jay, without hatred. I pictured him tired, patient, perhaps clumsy at fatherhood. Hatred is a luxury reserved for those who can afford purity. What I felt instead was a broken, shifting empathy that made the world less absolutes and more a series of entangled consequences. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition that lives pass through one another like projectiles and sometimes embed. The final twist, the part that keeps unspooling in my mind, wasn't cinematic in any tidy way. It was this. The betrayal that started with a smudge of lipstick on an armrest had broadened into responsibility. The person I used to think my marriage was only about her was now apparent to someone who would grow up with both of our names attached to them. I could rage at what had been taken, or I could accept that reality had changed and respond with as much humanity as I could exhale. On a rainy afternoon not unlike the one when Grandpa had first asked about the SUV, I took the child to the park where we had argued and reconciled and given up on ourselves in orbit. The small hand clung to mine with ferocious trust. The line between what I had lost and what I still could be blurred. But under the bleached light of that day I understood something that did not console so much as instruct. Betrayal is a beginning for some things and an ending for others. Grandpa watched from his gate, not asking why I had arrived in an Uber. He just stood there with the map of his face softened by time. In the car seat, the child slept, the drawing of a house warm with too many rays of sun. The future would demand work, conversation, apologies, and a kind of endurance I had never signed up for. But it would also require me to decide what kind of man I would become in its shadow. We walked home.